Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for attending this month's segment of the White Bureau Site Cleanup Office Hours. I'm Millie Garcia Serrano, and I serve as the Assistant Commissioner for the Bureau of Site Cleanup, and it's really a pleasure to be with you this morning here. As we continue to work together as a team in the spirit of collaboration, MassDEP, BWSC providing more assistance and guidance that hopefully gets us into additional and more augmented compliance with all of the requirements of the Mass Contingency Plan. This morning, we're going to talk more extensively and really more focused on a very important piece of our MCP, which really gets at active exposure pathway mitigations measures, which we call APOMs, and really a focus on the operating regimen for these APOMs. As you all know, MassDEP has been working on drafting guidance related to APOMs, and this is really a very important underpinning of protecting human health and the environment under our risk-based regulatory scheme at MassDEP across the Commonwealth. The APOM operating regime is required, as you all know, under 310 CMR 40.1025 and also 40.1026. And it's really applicable for permanent, temporary, and remedy operating status sites. This has to be designed in order to ensure a level of no significant risk, and it needs to be maintained at that level to ensure that there is protectiveness for individuals and receptors that basically need to be protected under normal operating conditions. So we are today exploring this guided conversation, just trying to elicit support, comment, experiences, obstacles to ensuring protectiveness, and we really would like to hear from you. Typically, our office hours are 1 hour long. This morning, we will hold a 2-hour session, again, to focus on APOMs, and we are really looking forward to interactive dialogue. We will set the stage by way of providing some background information, as well as also then providing some context for the conversation through 6 questions that more or less will hopefully guide the conversation between MassDEP and you. So with that, I'd like to turn this conversation over to Brian Roden, who is our Acting Division Director for our Policy and Planning Division. Thank you.
Thanks, Millie. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending. Like Millie said, we really want this to be an interactive meeting. We want to hear from you folks. I'm joined by John Fitzgerald, and hopefully a lot of you were able to attend the last advisory committee meeting where John kind of walked through some of the work that he's done in the Northeast region. We're going to kind of summarize a little bit of that quickly and then try to hear from you and hear some feedback. But I'll go through some quick slides, just real quick. All right, so before we get into the operating regimen discussion, just kind of a little compliance reminder, public service announcement here. MassDEP sent out the APOM annual certification letters. Those were sent out on March 12th. Those APOM annual certification letters go to APOMs that are operating under a permanent solution, and they're required to certify annually based on a receipt of a letter from us. And so those went out March 12th this year, and the total 85 letters, those are all the permanent solutions that have APOMs operating with them. So it went out to everyone. That's what we've been doing the last few years, a big round in March out to everyone. Again, this year, and this is the 3rd year in a row, it includes the request for a shutdown restart, and that's just to ensure that the telemetry is working at the site, which is obviously a component. We'll kind of talk about that a little bit more in terms of the operating regimen. All those documents, all the letters we sent are uploaded on and available on searchable sites for the specific RTNs. And then as we receive the actual certification back from the property owner, those will be posted to searchable sites as well. So if you are working with a client or have worked with a client that you closed out a site with a permanent solution with an APOM, you may want to check in on that RTN on searchable sites, check in with them to see if they need any assistance in completing that annual certification. And so what does that look like? I think probably a lot of you have seen this before. This is the actual form that they're returning. It's 2 pages front and back here. On the left is what they're certifying to, and then on the right, this is the back of the form actually, and it's just to document the shutdown restart test. There's a cover letter that goes along with it. And these annual certification letters with the shutdown restart test information can be sent back electronically to Sarah Hughes. There's her contact info. We prefer it to be sent electronically, emailed directly to Sarah. You can also send it via regular mail to our Boston office. But again, the preference would be to email that back to Sarah. And her contact is on the cover letter too, her email and phone number. If there's any questions, feel free to reach out directly to her or to myself. And then just so we can see what people are certifying to, just blowing up those 5 bullet points that people are actually certifying, the property owner is certifying. So they're aware of their obligation to maintain the APOM and repair and replace components. They're aware that they need to notify both the department and any non-transient occupants within 30 days. Well, if there's a failure that lasts 30 days or more. They are aware that MassDEP can inspect that system. I mean, obviously these sites all have AULs, and that's the same language as in the AUL. And they have the financial resources that are available to fix that system if necessary. And then finally, this kind of leads into our topic today here. The system is operating pursuant to the regimen established. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that operating regimen and the importance of it. So these property owners are certifying that they are operating that system in accordance with that operating regimen. So very important to make sure we have that. And I'm just going to pause there to see if there's any specific questions regarding the ABM certification letters before moving to the discussion about the operating regimen guidance. All right.
And just as a quick reminder, your feedback is very important because, again, as we stated, MassDEP, our Bureau for Site Cleanup, is currently working on drafting this guidance. So we want to ensure that any issues, concerns, obstacles, opportunities are highlighted today and really spoken to. Therefore, our hope is that upon release of this draft guidance, it really resonates with the reality of what licensed site professionals and PRPs or other persons or individuals undertaking the necessary response actions. We'd like to make sure that all of those concerns are captured and understood by the department as we move forward again with drafting this guidance that will hopefully be out for public comment. Thank you.
All right. So again, myself and John are here. We want to hear from you folks. So either raise your hand or throw something in the chat. I don't know that I can see the chat while I'm sharing my screen. So John, maybe you can keep an eye on that for me. But please, we want to hear from you. Like Millie said, we've started putting together a guidance document in terms of what should be in this draft operating regimen, but want to get your input. All right. Some of this will be a little repetitive since what John presented on in February, but just to set the stage, and I guess I should have said that the draft operating regimen, we're focused on APOMs that are related to vapor intrusion. So that's kind of just put that out there. The background, John presented this in 2014. The MCP allowed for a permanent solution with an APOM, both vapor intrusion or private well, to now achieve a permanent solution. Before 2014, that was not possible under the MCP. And again, today we're just focusing on the vapor intrusion APOMs. The private well APOM is a different discussion. And so as we talked about, APOMs must run in accordance with the operating regimen for both permanent solutions, temporary solutions, as well as ROS. Those regs are in 1025 and 1026. And just for fun here, we're going to throw them up on the screen. And so pulling out kind of a couple pieces of 1025.3. These are the regulations related to APOMs operating as part of a permanent solution. And so we can see that the operating regimen, needs to be designed to ensure a level of no significant risk is maintained for the receptor. And also, the operating regimen outlines the parameters for the APM operating and the methods and frequency of monitoring. So that's kind of what we want to get at. What are those types of things? What are the methods, the parameters that should be measuring? What methods are using? How frequent are they happening? Also, in it further on, and we've touched on telemetry a little bit, but in 1025 3D is really outlined in terms of the telemetry as well. So 1026 parallel regulations again. So you can have a APM operating as a permanent solution. You can also have an APM operating under a temporary solution or remedy operation status (ROS). The regulations are pretty similar. They're very parallel. You still have to maintain no significant risk for the receptor. And then again, the operating regimen has to have those parameters for the APM to operate and the methods and frequency of monitoring. And so just kind of to sum up what those regulations generally mean, the operating regimen, again, it's got to be designed to ensure a level of no significant risk. And so it's designed and to continue to operate and maintain that level of no significant risk. And the operating regiment's got to document the parameters of how you're doing that and how you're monitoring that and how you're still continuing to ensure that that level of no significant risk is being maintained. A lot of these systems are going to run for a long time. So the length of time might be a factor here. You need to understand that the system is going to continue to run and be necessary to maintain that it's maintaining that condition of no significant risk. So you need to think about the time frame as well. Also, you need to establish the vacuum ranges. This is something, and John can talk more about this, but showing that you have that negative pressure, that you're maintaining that pressure field under the slab. Manometers on pipes are obviously very easy to install and useful to show that you are maintaining that vacuum at points. And then we talked about telemetry. So, systems must employ remote telemetry, and there's definitely a component of that as well. But the telemetry has got to be defined in the operating regimen as to what it is, how it is, who it's notifying. We have definitely seen people come to us and say, "Oh, how do I change my telemetry?" And they say, "MassDEP, can you add me to the list of the telemetry?" And they're new property owners, and our response is the telemetry was installed by whoever was the previous owner. We're not in control of that. We don't have access to that. We're on the list, or should be, but they need to figure that out, obviously. And so that's kind of one of our next points in the presentation later, is that property owners need to be involved in these operating regimens and know what the systems are. And we've definitely seen an issue with future property owners per se. All right, so we've definitely done some, inspections, audits of sites. John's done a lot of work in Northeast along with his group. And so what have we found? John presented kind of this slide in February, and what things that we're looking for. We're looking for LSPs to really take ownership of the operating regiment. When you're filing that permanent solution, temporary solution ROS, they need to be aware of what's in that document. They need to make sure, again, that it's going to be sufficient for the purpose. So if it's a permanent solution, that operating regiment needs to be applicable to the current property owner and then to future property owners. They need to know how to run that system. And we'd like them to really take ownership of those documents and really make sure they're aware of the components and continue to maintain no significant risk at those sites. We talked about property owners and PRPs as well. It's difficult, obviously, once you've achieved a permanent solution and the property is sold and you have a new property owner. That's a difficult situation because many times that new property owner doesn't have an LSP involved or on board. I think it would be very useful if they did, and I would highly recommend them to. but we've definitely seen situations where they don't. But we would really like to see the property owners be invested in there. That system, the APM, is there to protect people in the building from contamination coming up through the slab. So we want them to be invested, to know how that system is running, and to follow up and do that monitoring to ensure that's happening. One of the components obviously is the telemetry. The annual certification, we talked about that, is obviously a component as well. But there's some on-site monitoring things that probably should happen as well, and kind of want to really get your thoughts on those things. But we're not holding ourselves out of this. We're saying we need to take more responsibility as MassDEP. We obviously need to protect public health. That's what we're statutorily charged to do. So we're developing guidance. Obviously we'll continue to do audits and inspections of these sites and make sure that they're working to maintain no significant risk. All right, so that's kind of to frame the whole discussion. We've got a bunch of questions here. Again, feel free to put things in the chat, raise your hand. We really want to hear from people to see what elements and what things you think should be in operating regimens. So, John, I guess I'll ask you first. Were there things you wanted to add before we get into the discussion questions, or just kind of go with the questions?
Brian, you did a great job. We can get right to the questions.
Thanks, John. All right, so first question here: what specific elements need to be included in the operating regimen submittal? So, that can be, maybe it depends. Permanent, temporary solution, ROS, maybe they're different. But just looking for ideas here. Again, we have thoughts too, but wanted to open things up and see what people think about what needs to be included in there.
Well, I can. Is somebody else going to speak? Sorry, I just had a workman come in the house, and the dogs are going nuts. Brian?
Yeah, go ahead, Andy.
So obviously, I think the pressure, the pressure checks through the slab are, sort of state the obvious. They should be checking the pressure to make sure that the system is maintaining the pressure, which could be lost under the slab, not from the extraction point, but obviously that's, there's a manometer on that, and it'll tell you how much it's pulling. But to take subslab pressure measurements at the subslab points, I think is important, because various things could happen that could disrupt the negative pressure that's being created there. I just want to be careful about how frequently we ask them to do this, because again, I just want to keep in mind that people, the more we require of these SSD systems, I'd like to hear the results of John's studies, and how if there's been like breakthrough from the SSD into indoor air from subsurface vapors. But these systems, we really, when we were doing the vapor intrusion guidance, we selected the systems because they're known to be the most reliable thing out there. People put them in their homes to prevent radon all the time. And at the time, and we didn't want to, people were like putting in passive systems, which are just not as effective. Depending on which way the wind's blowing, you could get vapor intrusion, you may not. And so the more requirements we put on the SSD systems, which I think it's good to have some. I'm not saying we shouldn't be talking about this, but we just want to be aware we don't want to push people into passive systems either, that we don't have any regulatory requirements if they're preventing NSO. They just do a passive and demonstrate that it's effective, and I think they're done. In fact, yeah. So we have no regulatory requirements for passive systems that are fixing NSR. and they're not as reliable. And we don't have anyone check after a permanent solution with a passive system. So I'm not saying we shouldn't do it with active systems like this. I just say we want to be careful in that we're not like quote unquote encouraging, or not quote unquote, just we're not encouraging people to be putting in passive systems because active systems are just becoming such a hassle. So that's, but to answer the question after that little aside, I think, checking the subsat pressure through the pressure points would be important for me.
Okay. All right. Isaac, you want to go ahead?
I think you're on mute.
There we go.
Yep.
All right. Picking up where Andy left off there, and kind of tie into how do you get the owners to be engaged and the future owners and recognize that there's some kind of condition. I think it's either table 3.1 or table 3.2, but there is something in the vapor intrusion guidance now that says annual pressure checks across the floor slab are required until such time that the SSDS is no longer needed. I remember many years ago in a SAC meeting asking Paul Locke about that, and if that meant even for systems that had a permanent solution, because it didn't specify. And his response was yes, it did. And so I've been ever since then prescribing that in my operating regimens, that once annually, and usually kind of around the time of the certification, that the owner verified the pressure field differential across the floor slab. I mean, they're relying on the telemetry, they're relying on the gauges if they have periodic inspections. But I think if you included that in the annual certification and just said, hey, per each SSDS system that you have installed, intended to cover a certain section of your building, what's the sub-slab pressure differential? How does that match up with the operating regimen? And that's just kind of an indicator, a key to keep people engaged. I think, I'm not sure how it would be incorporated into the operating regimens, but maybe another way to ensure that these systems are being utilized as intended would be to somehow alleviate some of the requirements for the owners if they were able to demonstrate that they had a service contract, either with an installer or a environmental professional, that somebody else was maintaining that for them. That might be of use. But I guess getting back to the original question, what information needs to be included, I think that's entirely dependent on the complexity of the system. If you have a single radon fan in line, and you've installed it per the VI guidance, if there's not a lot of pipe, if there's not a lot of worry, maybe it's residential, an unfinished, unused basement, not a high likelihood of anything being damaged, maybe just an annual pressure check across the floor slab would be sufficient. If you have a system that's manifolded to many extraction points, and the building that was constructed has varying degrees of transmissivity through the soil, because it was built during different times, so there's different relative permeabilities below the slab. Maybe one's stone, one's fill, one's just sitting on clay or something like that. You have to adjust the manifold valves to control the flow to get the vacuum distribution you require. Then you may also want to have some kind of a flow measurement included in your operating regimen for airflow, because if you're using a ball valve to do that, an inline ball valve, which a lot of people do, unless it's a calibrated ball valve that every time you turn it, it kind of clicks into a notch, it's really hard to say, well, that was about half open or a third open or a quarter open. That's all relative. The only way to really verify that you have the right amount of vacuum that you're getting your pressure field points, if those valves get changed or if a pipe breaks, would be to dial it in using airflow. So we also include that on systems that have multiple extraction points being controlled that way. But again, I think it really, what would be required would be dependent on how complex a system you have. Do you have inline particulate filtration and moisture separation, all that sort of stuff would need to be included, and schedules for changing the filters, or at least testing a pressure drop across the filter so when they're clogged. Do you have auto draining functions? Have you winterized your system so that you're using heat trace and that sort of stuff? How frequently does that need to be checked to make sure that that's not failed? So again, big difference between a large industrial building and a single family residence. So I think it's got to be some kind of sliding scale.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Definitely what's included depends on the design and the complexity of your system. So that can widely vary.
I see a lot of comments from Matt Hatman, so I don't know if we want to address those comments at this time. And thank you, Isaac.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't see the chat, Millie, because
Okay, let's see. Okay, so Matt is stating, and Matt, you're here, we need to get all our SSDSS APOMs doing continuous vacuum compliance monitoring. I'm trying to get to the older systems. I am LSP 4 to upgrade, requiring more frequent monthly, at least quarterly, physical checks on the SSDSs could be an important step in incentivizing RPs to choose to upgrade, and as importantly, allow DEP and consultants LSP to be able to remotely monitor the full SSDS operation. This is especially important for closed sites, PSC with APOM, where the relationship with the consultant/LSP may be severed. So that's one of two comments from Matt. I'm going to pause here, and Matt, if you don't mind expanding upon that, and then we will move forward with your second comment.
So, well, John and I are having a private, or I'm having a private conversation, I think, with John, if he's looking anywhere. But it is one of the issues that I grow concerned about, because sites do get closed out with the PSC and the APOM, and so most of my comments are related to how do we know that that is continuing to perform as designed. And my third comment related to going off what Isaac said is, if things can change, that the concentrations in groundwater under a residence, just for an example, might be at some such concentration at the time the system is designed. We always hope that it's going to always go down, but that isn't necessarily the case. I mean, plumes move, new releases occur, et cetera, et cetera. So I know John and I talked, I think, at the previous SAC or whatever, office hours, about the issue of, can we actually monitor the vacuum at the extreme points, just to verify that we actually have the vacuum we think we have in a continuous method. But I think that is really important, and even at the level that we're doing the overall system, just making sure that the system vacuum is working, that the rotor hasn't locked up or something, is still critically important, because it allows us, the consultant, whatever, to know that the system is working, and it allows DEP to know that the system is really working, not just on, but working. And I had a long heart-to-heart conversation last night, as I mentioned to you, Millie, with the client, and explained the importance of this. And it turned out they had other concerns that had not related, that had prohibited them from doing this, not understanding. And when I explained the idea of doing the continuous monitoring, so that we know the system is working, we can check right from our office. DEP will know right away if the vacuum goes off, and they were very much in favor of this. So, and compared to that particular site is in an IRA and should be doing, correct, it will be doing the monthly system checks, but when the client looks at the cost of the monthly system checks and the cost of switching over to continuous monitoring, their answer was, give me the pricing and let's get the systems upgraded. They operate two systems because it just makes sense. And since one of the systems they're responsible for is an off property on another property owner site, this would allow them to know that the system is working without having to constantly reach out to the other property owner, get access to go in and look at the system, just so that they know. So I understand that originally there was a cost component that made this unattractive, perhaps, and maybe I'm talking consultants out of more consulting time to go out and physically do system checks, but I think it would be a way to get better certainty. And I think when clients really understand that and the issues with it not working and what the consequence of that might be, it's what you might call short money. But that's just my experience. I'd be interested to hear what other people have to say, but I'm really concerned about this.
Yep. Yeah. So Matt, just I think that those are great comments. Thank you for that. I mean, I will share. I've spoken to some property owners, again, in the same kind of situation where they're doing the annual certification. There's no LSP involved. They like the continuous monitoring because it's a bigger facility. But same thing, like they're the property management company. They want to see that the system is running, so they like continuous monitoring. I think it's definitely a tool that can obviously be utilized by everyone. So I think.
Yeah, I was just talking with a property manager on a site in Connecticut. Sorry, but the same sort of thing applies because property management is not just a guy sitting in an office anymore. We were like, oh, and hey, there was an issue with accessing a well and some other issues we had at the site, and we're on a Teams call, and the guy just like, oh, wait a minute. He calls up his cameras. He can see his cameras let him see the entire site and what's going on. And so the idea of saying, oh yeah, you could have this other screen where you can see that this important thing is working. It's like, yeah, I already have that. They check the elevators and the HVAC remotely or something now. He can see all the properties, the operating characteristics, and this would just be one more to him. So He thought this was a great idea.
Yeah, I do want to say, and I see that Isaac has his hand up. If there are, in consideration of the fact that a lot of the onerous and responsibility falls on parties that own the property owners, PRPs, other persons, etc. MassDEP Site Cleanup is also interested in ideas regarding outreach with other associations or groups that may influence, for positive change here in terms of the operating regimen and otherwise just assuming all the responsibilities. So if you have ideas or additional outreach that MassDEP could do, whether it's inserting a flyer inside, a letter, electronic letter or paper letter that again spells out the expectation responsibilities to basically ensure that we have that message going out, maybe during the course of active actions before the site is in a permanent or ROS or temporary solution. Just please give us ideas and let us know. Isaac.
So I guess building off what Matt was saying a little bit, something that resonated with me was changing conditions. And there's a few different things with respect to that, but one of them, I think what would be incredibly helpful to LSPs or practitioners, people who are responsible for coming up with developing the operating regimens, is some assistance or methodology in guidance for determining what constitutes an alarm condition. And I've seen folks struggle with that, and I've also seen this kind of comes full circle with making sure that the owners are engaged. Let's say you have a high flow, low vacuum system, and you can have even weather conditions that change, barometric pressure, wind blowing across the pipe that are able to affect the vacuum in the pipe and kind of trick the telemetry into thinking there's an alarm condition, sending a notice. You may have a situation where the owner gets 35 notices in one day, and it's because of changing conditions either in the building or weather conditions, and that tends to lead to them ignoring the email notifications. And then eventually something does happen that is significant, and they don't know about it because they have this many emails coming from the system. They don't really know what they mean. And so, setting some kind of brackets around or offering information or guidance on how to determine or define what constitutes an alarm condition, I think would be a big thing in terms of helping the owners at the end not ignore those messages and actually respond when there is a problem. That being said, I think, kind of another hole in the system that isn't always cleanly addressed is changes to HVAC systems. If you're using an APM, you're not including that in your AUL, in your permanent solution, in your AUL for APM operation, and the heating system gets changed, your system may be performing at the exact same airflows and vacuums, but if the building pressurization has changed, it may no longer be achieving that cross slab pressure differential that you were targeting initially. So even though it would appear that the system is working as intended, something intrinsic to the building has changed. Maybe you had, a system where you had HRV supplying fresh air to the building, and all the rest of the individual units in the building were just recirculating air. So your only air supply in was from the HRV. And if the balance of that was off such that you created a negative pressure in the building envelope, or if it got out of balance over time, or if they ended up changing the system in the building such that it wasn't balanced, because they're usually only plus or minus 10%. And those types of systems handling airs in large buildings typically have the vacuum capacity to overcome an SSDS. So, I guess that kind of gets back to that annual check across the pressure differential check across the slab is also important for that. But, having some way of defining what constitutes an alarm and for how long does that condition have to be recognized before it's actually an alarm, I think would be useful to a lot of practitioners. I see folks struggle with that.
Yeah, thanks. I know there's definitely been questions on how long. I mean, the regs say immediately, so you can interpret that. But I do understand your question. Or your point, but it's a valid point. If you continually get notifications, you get 100 notifications a day, you kind of tend to ignore them. It's the whole boy who cried wolf theory. So that's a good point. Andy, you have another something to add here?
Yeah, Brian, also, I just wanted to note that there are some additional comments from the public. So at some point we need to also
sure.
answer.
Yeah. Go ahead in the chat if you want, Millie. How about that?
Okay, so do you want to have Andy weigh in and comment, or do we proceed with the questions from the public?
Either way, I guess.
So let's do these questions, and Andy, just with your permission on that. We have an incoming question from William Hansen. Okay, this is in determining operating regimes, should the requirement of 310 CMR 40.1025 3D and equivalent 1026, so the regs citations that we're talking about today, be read to require SSDS systems have, at least temporarily, a dilution air valve or other throttling device to determine what minimum negative pressure at the extraction pipe results in an insufficient propagation of a vacuum field. So I think it's asking the requirements going back to the to these peril regulations.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's important. I'm going to let John answer that, but obviously you need to know up front. You need to design your system to know that it's meeting no significant risk and the parameters that you've designed. But I'll let John. I'm assuming John can handle that one.
Yep.
Well, ideally, you would have done a diagnostic evaluation to ascertain the relationship between pressure and flow. But yeah, it's a good point, and it kind of ties into Isaac's point about trying to ascertain the level at which an alarm should be triggered. And I think it's part of that same kind of issue to get into.
Okay. And then the next comment from Matt Hale. Great discussion, thank you. A couple of questions. One that might not be a tad side topic. If so, we can discuss separately offline. Well, here are the questions. What is the expectation with regards to APOMs on DPS sites? So those are downgrading property status sites. I'm going to stop there because there's another question as a follow-on.
Yeah, good question, Matt. I mean, we do see, obviously DPS sites need to address that IRA condition and mitigate imminent hazards. It can obviously get complicated depending if there is or is not an upgrading PRP identified. That's something we need to look into and see what the path forward is for that DPS site, I guess.
And I think it's really important that for someone who's ascertaining DPS, they need to provide access. For example, there are some minimum requirements, or at least spelled out in our mass contingency plan, that speak to maintaining a DPS status in good standing. Otherwise, I think we will view the site as a potential source. And obviously that triggers a whole different cascade of enforcement. So that's the first question. I think, the DPS is basically just focused on providing that line of evidence that points to it's not me, it's somebody else. And again, going back to the requirements to maintain a downgrading property status for liability protection purposes. Number two, I suspect that most LSPs are focused on the minimum vacuums in their operating regimens. Can you clarify how the max top of vacuum range is to be established? Second part, I presume you basically want to see regular fan operation close to good fan efficiency.
I would just weigh in that, yes, the range has to include an upper range as well, a vacuum. We see that as an issue. We have a site where every time it rains and the water table comes up, the vacuum goes way up because the fan's kind of just dead ending. And that's an indication that's happening. Another site where the vacuum went way up and we basically think that it's not working anymore because there's just not air flowing through it. So yes, and how to establish that again is part of the evaluation of the system and determining at what level are you going beyond the expected range. And that would be a trigger to indicate there may be something going on that needs to be investigated.
Thank you, John. Andy.
Hi. Figure out how to put my hand down. There we go. I just back to what Matt was talking about. I think, Matt, you were referring to some cases that were putting in systems under immediate response action mode. Is that right?
Yes, Dr.
Me or Matt Hackman?
Oh, which one? Yes.
Oh, Matt Hackman.
Okay.
Yeah. So I want to be distinguished between putting SSD systems in to mitigate CEPs under IRA mode, as opposed to what I think the focus of the discussion today is, which is systems that are installed to maintain NSR at a site. I worry that we're already getting pushback on the feasibility of putting in these systems that the department is already determined is generally feasible to mitigate CEPs. Because under the IRA regs, they can say, well, this is too expensive, it's not feasible. And we've been getting incredibly high estimates from one consulting firm to mitigate CEPs and for these basically radon systems. And they say we're not going to mitigate the CEP because it's going to cost $60,000, which is crazy. So my concern is that we clarify or we don't put too much burden, cost burden on PRPs that are installing systems during immediate response actions to mitigate CEP. Otherwise, they at some point they may very well have an argument that this is just too expensive. You're asking us to do all this stuff. Just wanted to throw it out there as sort of a warning, and make sure that, again, it'd be nice to see the data to see how many times these things fail over time. Right. So I think I just wanted to put that out as a bit of a warning. Again, same thing. The more burden we put on, the more they will shy away from putting in these systems, which generally are generally accepted to be pretty great. So that's it.
Let's just keep in mind that there is a reason why we're having this conversation today, which is about addressing the exposure and protecting those that are inside buildings. We are not forcing anybody to go into this APUM operating regime. If it is something that could be maybe abated through source removal and going in a different pathway, I think that was what we were contemplating when the regulations changed to allow for permanent solutions with conditions, and the condition being an operating system. So I think we're trying to balance how you spend, how PRPs and folks that are responsible for sites across the Commonwealth, where to put the money, whether it's a permanent solution outright or a permanent solution with conditions. And again, the condition being this system. And the system, if it's going to be up and running, it's going to run the correct way. Otherwise, we are distorting the overall perception that we are protecting human health. So just a comment out there, we're all about ensuring protection of human health. That's why we are in the place that we are as regulators and working together with LSPs and PRPs, other persons, property owners. I agree there's got to be a balance, but at the end, we've got to find efficient ways to get at the goal, which is protection.
I agree, Millie. You're really on point there with protecting human health, and the we're talking about requirements that need to happen when this thing goes into a permanent solution to maintain NSR. The earlier on in the process, very early on, when we want them to have an exposure, that's, say, it's a CEP, but not necessarily a significant risk. But we want to stop that exposure because that's sensitive populations and what have you. I just want to call out a distinction between those doing SSD systems for those two things, because if we pile on for systems that are mitigating CEPs, they will rebut that and say we're not going to fix the CEP, and you can't make a CEP because you put all these these guidelines on here, and so we're not going to put the system in, and we want them to put these systems in to quickly address the CEP and stop people from being exposed to whatever levels in their homes. So that's where I'm coming from.
Yeah, we definitely need to work together in finding more efficient ways. And obviously, at the end, compliance is paramount, not only from a regulatory standpoint, but really truly to prevent exposures. So
Right.
let's continue this dialogue and really identify obstacles as well as opportunities.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think we should move on to questions, although we've been kind of jumping around the different issues, but
Yep.
Yeah, let's go into question number 2, John, if you may just moderate that question.
Yeah, in terms of number 2 was what actions are needed to determine that the APIM's continuing to maintain no significant risk, and people have touched upon that with annual inspections, telemetry issues, and also that goes into kind of number 5 with respect to whether there should be periodic indoor air sampling to confirm or affirm that the site continues to be at a condition of no significant risk. So I'd like to get people's input on that as well.
Yeah, thoughts, experiences welcomed.
So John, under the current guidance we have, in section 3 of the VA guidance, we have them do 1 round of testing to demonstrate effectiveness of the system. And after that, they just need to maintain the pressure. And I think that, we had a lot of discussions back in the 2010s about this with these systems. And we agreed that because they are generally so effective, if you demonstrate that they're working once, you don't need to keep resampling the indoor air. Obviously, as long as they're maintaining their pressure under the slab and things like that. So that's where we were coming from. But maybe there are reasons that just making sure the pressure field is there isn't enough. I don't know. But that's the assumption sort of we've been going on.
Right.
Well, that's the question, Andy. Maybe Isaac, you got your hand up. Do you have any comments on that?
I do. I can say that recently I was sitting on the ANSI ARST committee, the American Association of Radon Scientists and Technologists, for developing standards for long-term stewardship of radon mitigation systems in residences, multifamilies, large schools, commercial buildings. And often I think their standard is set to resample if it's kind of different criteria depending on they tier the sites essentially, but they are required to resample in some instances every 2 years. And if you're talking about 100 or 150 plus HUD unit and you need to sample 100% of the ground floors and then 10% of each floor above, access, it becomes a nightmare. And part of the thing that they recently incorporated into the guidance documents is the ability to use telemetry to alleviate some of those longer term sampling requirements. Because I do think that would be a huge burden. It's already really difficult to get access to a lot of places, especially if you're talking off property contamination. It's really tough, especially when there's tenants and not just the owner of the property involved, of the affected property involved. So I think that, you lean more heavily on that pressure field, on making sure that the area of affected soil gas has been truly defined and that you are achieving the minimum pressure field differential in that area. The market's not quite there yet, but it's coming. There are going to be sensors that are capable of measuring pressure differential remotely and relaying that to telemetry. I think that will be a big game changer when that does come around. But for now, I think it would be overly burdensome and probably drive more people away from the active mitigation systems if they were, to Andy's point, if they were having to then say, yeah, you know what, you guys are done, but you're not really done. We got to come back every 5 years or something and sample. It just becomes unattainable for the end users.
But is it all or nothing at all? Sampling every single unit versus selective sampling in locations that in the past had the highest levels?
I think it's just more about the looking at it from the industry perspective, and looking at it from kind of a real estate perspective. Folks are going to be, they're going to shy away from having to use that. It's going to make their property, I guess, have a stigma, be a little bit devalued, because there's always some kind of a condition attached to it. And folks are going to have a harder time, I think, doing that. I get your point, John. I do think it's important to make sure, because as Matt said, conditions can change. Maybe the groundwater plume deviates over time, and now something that wasn't affected is affected. But again, I mean, if you can demonstrate that you're maintaining those pressure differentials across the slab, hypothetically, you shouldn't be encountering a vapor intrusion condition.
No, I take your point from the real estate perspective, but from the occupant perspective, we're telling them that, we're probably 95% sure that you're all set. Okay. Things like TCE with even short-term exposures are problematic. 95% is good, but is it enough? And you mentioned yourself, HVAC can change. So your initial evaluation assumed a certain air exchange rate, which has completely changed. There's different exposure points. So we've got to balance those two objectives. And again, I think the idea of sampling, every single unit is probably excessive, but I don't necessarily believe that selective locations would necessarily be inappropriate. So I think we need to balance the concerns of both the real estate as well as the people that are actually living in those locations.
Oh, I agree. I just think that there's no perfect system at this point, given the cost of it would be great if we could have continuous indoor air quality monitoring that would relay back to telemetry, so we would know that, mini mobile GCMSs that would constantly tell us what the air concentration is. Just the technology is not there. So there's limitations we're working with. And I being that this is almost the only thing that I do, exposure is paramount to me. And I see a lot of sites that do have deficiencies, and I go to sites that have been kind of abandoned over time, and it's tough to see that kind of thing. So I understand what you're saying, John, for sure. I just don't have an opinion on, or I don't have an idea that I think would solve the problem necessarily.
Well, I think the proposal would be to do selective sampling in locations. If you got a big apartment building and, with 100 units, I'm not suggesting you do 100 units, but perhaps selective units that in the past had the highest concentrations of concern. So those are things we need to kind of think about.
I think we also go back to a statement, Isaac, that you noted way back in the conversations we started, which is there's no one size fits all. We may need a sliding scale predicated on, is your client a one property location versus, what you are noting as, say, 150 plus HUD building. So I think this is really great commentary to kind of consider that there are some challenges when you have single point versus multiple units. So I appreciate you bringing that up.
In the end, the exposure is still the exposure, though, to John's point, whether it's one person or 150, and there's so much variability in large buildings that you might just miss the target unit. I mean, there's no way to get 100% of everything, unfortunately. So finding a way that gives you a higher degree of certainty about, the long-term stewardship of these systems versus offsetting Andy's concern that you're going to be driving people away from the active systems because they're just going to be infeasible or too much of a hassle or make a property unsaleable. It's a tough balance.
Yeah, agreed. The exposure is the exposure. I definitely agree with you on that. And then the question becomes, what are there's just different obstacles, different things that you encounter when you're dealing with, again, a one point area versus multiple units, access could be one, et cetera. So I think trying to see what strategy works best to ensure that the exposures are abated or mitigated in both scenarios.
Just to add, there's been continuous references to driving people away from an active system. If you're going to go with a passive system, you got to show pretty well that that's going to be adequate. That's a pretty high burden to show. So I understand the concern here in the balance, but I think I don't want to give unnecessarily weight to this idea that somehow they're not going to do what needs to be done if we put too many obstacles. If they're going to do a passive system, that's a high hurdle, at least in my mind, to show that that's going to be effective.
Yeah, I mean, the high hurdle simply is that they need to do more runs of indoor air sampling up front. After that, they're and to respond to Matt's thing, the requirement is simply to maintain the integrity of the system.
No, they're going to show up front that that's going to be effective for the foreseeable future. And that's more than just a few rounds of air monitoring, but we can talk online on that. Let's get more input from the external community here.
It looks like Matt Hackman has his hand up.
Thank you, Brian. So again, I also think we need to distinguish. MassDEP is not guaranteeing or whatever indoor air quality. As our colleague Rich Rago demonstrated completely, persuasively, the person who brings their dry cleaning into their bedroom, and I've done this, had this checked as well, immediately goes over threshold values. It just, bam. We can't control all those other sources. So Isaac, that's why I think I would not focus on indoor air, because what we are focusing on is what is the indoor air exposure coming from the release? What is coming from under the building? We can't control what's coming into the building. And indoor air sampling is fraught with all kinds of confounding influences. We do our best, but from building materials, from occupant exposures. I had one on that same site I was discussing in the chat with you, John, where there was a hoarder person, and don't look at my background, but it turned out that they were the source of the indoor air issue in their unit, which we were trying to alleviate by adjusting the subslab depressurization system. So I think the focus, Isaac, might more appropriately be on monitoring the concentration under the slab. If the SSDS is operating, then it should reduce the concentrations beneath the slab to levels that would not present an indoor air impact. And since the difference between the concentrations under the slab, which are 2 to 3 orders of magnitude higher than in indoor air, right? There's a significant differential in concentrations between indoor air concentrations and subslab concentrations. But that higher concentration, one, makes them easier to measure. And I think I had added in a comment also, Brian and John, that, just checking that, we've got the vacuum field is working is one thing, but shouldn't we be also checking that, the VOC concentration under the slab is also achieving what the system was designed to do? I mean, that's what the system is designed to do. We're not in the business of vacuuming. What we're in the business of is reducing the subslab concentration so that by the time it gets into indoor air, if it gets into indoor air, it would not present a threat to human health.
Let me just ask a quick question here, because there's been continuous mention to doing evaluations of the pressure field, as well as Matt just suggested the concentrations of VOCs in subslab probes. Based upon our inspection, it's rare that those vapor probes are still accessible or in existence. Are people saying there should be a recommendation or requirement to maintain a system of subslab probes in these buildings?
again, just like we're primarily concerned, right, John? We're inferring that the most important vacuum point to measure is the one that is the most at the weakest, the farthest reach of the vacuum field. We have a sort of impression that, right, that the vacuum field is created by pressure drops. So we want to go out and see where it, that we're maintaining the vacuum at the most extreme points. And at the same point, why wouldn't, I think our systems have, if they don't, we're going to change that on the ones I'm responsible for, but should have a sampling point as well, so that the subslab soil vapor can be checked in addition to the vacuum. So yes, it may be maintaining better than 0.04 inches of water, or whatever, 1 Pascal. I'm trying to remember what the numbers are off the top of my head really fast. But also, again, is that concentration? It's really the concentration we're trying to reduce. And if that concentration is not within design parameters, then a greater vacuum is required or some kind of adjustment of the system. But I think trying to do it by sampling indoor air is problematic simply because there's so many other variables in indoor air. But maybe Isaac knows better. He's the most experienced.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Matt, John's point is, and I've seen it too at sites, is those subslab points are not there anymore. They've been cemented in, and so there's no access for us to collect that sample or check the pressure in those systems. So
I'm a big fan of the vapor pins, but similar ones. I mean, we had a system in a kitchen, a working kitchen, and in a restaurant, and those little caps right on the floor, they never even noticed them. And we would just come back, pick up the cap, take out the caps. There's our vapor point. We go in. They were washing the floors, scrubbing the floors all the time in a kitchen, but no problem. So I think that's a relatively low cost problem solution to a problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with Matt. We try to keep at least one per system, and include that in the operating regimen and document what you're not always going to have the same amount of vacuum. It's going to change over time, and weather conditions and how the building's being operated at the time you're taking the measurements. But you should at least have some kind of an anticipated range of pressure differential, and should be looking at that 1 point per system at a minimum. My opinion, it's very useful to know if the system's doing what it's supposed to. Even if you're getting the flows, if you had a low vacuum, high flow system, and a pipe got hit and broken, you may be achieving a similar amount of air if there was a void space below the slab. You're just pulling it from inside the building now instead of under the slab. So without having that point to check.
Well, my point, Isaac, was I think this could possibly, using a PPB ray or something, be as simple as just being able to take a PI, along with checking, yes, okay, I've got vacuum at the extreme point. I'm now going to open the sampling point and take a PID reading to verify that my VOC concentration is also where I expect it to be within my operating regimen.
I think you're preaching to the choir here. I'm telling you that based upon our inspections, it's very rare to find that they're still there. In fact, some people put in temporary probes and then they immediately cement them in. So other people out there, are there any opinions on this? Because it's just not being done.
It's being done in other states. I can say that for certain.
Is there a requirement in those other states?
Yes.
Thank you.
And Rachel, if you don't mind sharing information, sending back anything from other states, I think this is also great to see what other regulatory bodies consider in this dialogue. So,
yeah, sure. And I can speak to it briefly. I mean, Michigan definitely does. New Jersey has a requirement for an annual measurement, meaning the 0.004. I honestly can't think of states that don't, for the most part, require that as kind of the direct measurement of effectiveness.
And this is done long term in terms of over years, monitoring both the negative pressure and perhaps the concentrations?
Yes, negative pressure specifically. From the concentration standpoint, we do see reductions in concentrations typically over time. However, I guess I would disagree a little bit on the idea that that's the primary premise of the system. The primary premise of an SSDS system is to prevent vapor entry through depressurization. If concentrations go up in the subslab temporarily when the system starts to operate, that's okay because they're not entering, right? So, I mean, we've mitigated buildings with millions of micrograms per cubic meter in the subslab very effectively with SSDS because those vapors just can't enter anymore. So, yeah, definitely we do see concentration reductions. We often use that as a second line of evidence, especially if we're not seeing some of the stronger numbers that some of the states are looking for. Some of the states are looking for numbers larger than 0.004, unfortunately. Really just maintaining a negative differential of any value is going to be effective. But measuring those concentration reductions is a great line of evidence. We often do see areas that do get below criteria, but I wouldn't say that you have to get below criteria in order for your SSDS to be effective in preventing vapor intrusion.
Yeah, I agree, Rachel. And if they're at a point where the site is in permanent solution, then the plume should have been stable or contracting. It should have been defined, as should have the area of affected soil gas. So as long as you're maintaining that pressure, the concentrations over time really don't matter if you've really defined your affected area and depressurized it sufficiently.
All right, thanks.
Would you not agree that the vacuum and concentration are related? That, you know, if we have 1,000 milligrams per cubic meter of TCE under the slab, we might have an operating regimen that specified somewhat higher vacuum than if we had 5 micrograms per cubic meter under the slab, right?
I don't think so.
No.
I think you just need to get your pressure differential minimum across the extent of the affected soil gas, whether it's 1 million or 1, doesn't make a difference because you're creating a pressure gradient that the contaminants can't pass through to enter the building. Conceptually, I mean, different systems work in different ways. Sometimes with radon systems, you may be still getting vapors infiltrate. If it's a really high flow system and your slab is somewhat compromised, you may be getting with a low vacuum, you may be just getting some dilution so that what's getting into the building is being diluted, but it's a little bit dependent on the system, how it was designed and intended to work. But if it's a true depressurization system, your target is to get that vacuum field across the affected area of soil gas. Rachel, this is my understanding and how we operate.
Yeah, absolutely. If you've got pressure field extension over the area where the subslab vapors are present, there is no way for them to enter. The only caveat to that would be a preferential pathway that might, be a conduit, like conduit VI might be a separate issue that might not be addressed by the SSDS. But once you've established that pressure field, there should be nothing getting through.
Yeah, I agree. We typically see the levels drop because the transport becomes diffusion limited at that point, but it doesn't mean that if there's still high levels, it's not working properly. It's about the negative pressure. You also mentioned the preferred flow path, which I agree with, which is also one of my concerns with the possibility of doing some periodic indoor air monitoring just to ensure that we don't have that going on as well. Anyone else want to speak about the need or necessity or recommendation to have to maintain these negative these subslab soil gas probes? I can tell you from our inspections, not only do we not have those probes, but there may be sites with multiple extraction points And there's not even manometers on every extraction point. So we don't even know if there's a dead zone in an area because we have no way of measuring the negative pressure at the extraction point, never mind not having sub-slab probes out there to look at.
I think, John, obviously that's a big point, the manometers on extraction points. You know, at a minimum that should be installed on the system. And John's talking about those systems that are, there may be one fan and maybe there's one manometer on that fan where that location of the pipe there, but then that fan is manifolded into multiple 4 or 5 extraction points. So, and Isaac was talking about ball valves and airflow earlier. So, we don't know that one of those zones is not pulling a vacuum because there's only one manometer on the pipe over there. Theoretically, it should be, but again, there's no check for that. And then again, the lack of sub-slab probes to actually check differential pressure in different zones of the building, we can't measure that and can't show that. So that's a difficulty to show that the system's working. All right. Any other thoughts on I guess monitoring either indoor air or differential pressure post permanent solution here and ways to show the system is working? Anything, we got anything in the chat?
There's nothing in the chat thus far. 5 comments. I believe they've been addressed.
I guess we'll talk about this last question, which kind of ties into all this. So how can we incentivize property owners to conduct potential monitoring to show that the system is operating? Again, John's done a lot of inspections and I understand, you know, in certain situations, the LSP property owner relationship is no longer in place. But we still need to know that the system is operating. There's potential exposures that can still happen. So are there ways that we can incentivize those property owners to kind of do something to show that the system is working as it was designed to maintain that level of no significant risk? I know we talked about telemetry and continuous monitoring, but happy to hear other thoughts to engage these property owners.
If we are on a site that is a little more complicated, maybe multi-units or the system's a little more complex, we always have something that we build into our operating regimens for the owners to do. There's some kind of action item, even though they have the telemetry. It may be a semi-annual check, it may be a quarterly check, it may be an annual check, but we always have at the end of our operating regimen some kind of checklist. And it has to be very simple for the end user, you know, so that they can go through and identify the different points. You include photographs of the fans, their locations, the switches, the manometers, everything that's included, and just give them a simple check. Maybe, you know, once a quarter, they're looking at the slabs and making sure there's no new cracks. And maybe once a year with the pressure differential, they're also doing a comprehensive walkthrough and inspecting the pipes, making sure they're not broken, and testing the switches for the service switches for the fan, make sure all that works, doing a telemetry check, which you guys require already. Just looking at all the components and staying engaged, knowing it's there. We provide them with a 3-ring binder, leave it on site and say, you know, you need to fill these out to maintain compliance with your operating regimen. If DEP comes to do a check, your operating regimen has these. You need to have these sheets or documentation that you've been doing these inspections, that you've been engaged with this equipment, because stuff fails. Telemetry fails. Fans fail. You know, it's a better method than there used to be, but it's still not 100% foolproof.
Yep. Thank you, Isaac. Anyone else have any ideas about how to communicate this information to property owners, how best to go about that? Yep, Amy, go ahead.
The only other thought I had, and this might be driving outside our lanes, but for an owner-occupied facility, ultimately it's up to them. If they're not operating it properly and they're the occupant, it's their exposure. But for a landlord or an employer, reminding folks of their obligations to provide safe environments to their tenants and or employees might be a motivation.
Yep, that's a good comment. It is up to them to their choice to run that system. It is required per the AUL that was put in place.
Understood, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
It's hard.
I know what you mean. I know what you mean. Yep, it's still their choice.
Right.
We have tools to deal with that if they make that choice not to run that system, and we'll go down that path when and have gone down that path when necessary. Yeah, we do the annual certifications, which again is a reminder that goes to the property owner. So I guess to your situation, if there are tenants in a property owner situation, we're going directly to the property owner. Again, like how much time and investment they put in actually filling that certification out and thinking about what they're actually certifying to, I'm not sure sometimes.
Right. And
I would
again,
ask Rachel and people from that have experience in other states, how do other states handle this issue of long-term stewardship?
The PRPs maintain responsibility, but it's not completely handed over to the properties.
Well, what if the PRP is the property owner?
Well, yeah, great. I mean, but yeah, as the PRP, they are required to do, the maintenance on whatever frequency and monitoring, and then report that back to the state. So, yeah, I mean, there are requirements to maintain. They said doing like a lot of times it's an annual of a minimum annual measurement of differential pressure. Sometimes it's more frequent, earlier on, maybe in the beginning it's more frequent, and it goes to annual. But yeah, there would be a reporting requirement that went with those required measurements.
We have the same thing and it's not being done. Do other states have some kind of a regulatory mandate or consent agreement or some kind of a formal agreement that they require?
Some states use consent agreements, yes. But I mean, I guess if you're not doing it, you're out of compliance, right? And you'd be subject to whatever those ramifications are.
Right, which I think that's why maybe adding that to the annual certification, you're already checking the telemetry, be easy enough to add a line item of, what are your pressure differentials, and incorporating that into the systems. Yeah, you got to keep a vapor pin or a subslab monitoring port, differential monitoring port, at least one per system. And that way you can, have some measure of these, are these still working the way they should be. You already have a mechanism for the PRP to be, in contact and responding to you with the annual certifications. You just tack it onto that.
Go ahead, Matt.
I guess my 2 cents, all property owners, all sites are different. All property owners are a bit different. I like to think, and my experience has been that most get it. Not all of them are going to get it, which is the problem here. And until there's more of a hammer, it's probably not going to happen. At least to the comfort level we're trying to get here. Maybe, and not that I'm looking for work, but maybe it's just mandating, keeping the LSP involved, continuing to certify the thing in perpetuity. Putting the question of is the regiment correct in operating properly aside, but that might be maybe part of the answer is keeping us more involved on the post-closure after the fact. Just a thought.
Yep, appreciate that.
Thank you.
Matt Hackman, you got a comment?
Well, just in addition to Mr. Heil's comment, for this and for all what you would call AULs, I mean, Connecticut has the practice where there has to be annual inspections by the property owner But then every 5 years, there has to be a licensed environmental professional in Connecticut. But to Matt's point, the LSP has to do that inspection, but it's only every 5 years. So they're having the property owner do it, years 1 through 4, but on the 5th, 10th, 15th, 20th, they got to go get a licensed professional to come in and do that just to make sure everything is still the way it's supposed to be, whether it's the integrity of the asphalt or whether the SSDS is running.
John, there's your window for follow-up air sampling.
Yeah, if I could just follow up on that. Sorry, this is Mike Stiller. And just to follow up on both Matt's comments, I really like the idea and hearing the discussion this morning of the 5-year follow-up by an LSP. I think that makes a lot of sense from really just being able to evaluate, have conditions changed inside the building? I think that's my bigger concern. As an LSP, the longevity of these things. I've had a few of these in long-term ROS. We've done multiple rounds of, system problems, system shutdowns, and then a lot of indoor air testing, soil gas testing to really dial in and pinpoint, how long can the system be shut down and still be effective? Where are the effectiveness issues? And now we've got a system that's got remote telemetry that's telling us the flow and the vacuum on each of the individual now radon systems as opposed to one blower. So I have really high level of confidence that that system is continuing to be effective for the subsurface. I think my concern is that if something at the site changes, like there's all of a sudden a new tenant, a new HVAC system, a new sump that's been dug, a new tenant in a basement, something that's different than what it was before. And I think that 5-year window would be a really good opportunity to do that. I don't think it's really onerous on the property owners or the system operators, whoever it may be, the PRP or the building owner, in that if the LSP goes out in 5 years and everything's the exact same, it's low cost, right? There's no need to I don't think redo indoor air or redo an extensive sampling approach if nothing's changed and you're continuing to see system operations that suggest a high level of confidence. Certainly, if things have changed, then yes, I do agree with Matt Hackman that I'm really reluctant to do indoor air because there's just so many other potential sources. We don't have, actually, we may have some permanent vapor monitoring points. That'd be fine. I think in a residential situation, it gets a little complicated if there's carpeting or something that gets put in over them. How do you access them? The kitchen example that Matt Hackman presented would be great, but you may get into some situations where these are less accessible, but maybe you can put them in a closet or something that isn't going to have carpeting for long term. I don't know. Just my 2 cents. Thank you, guys. I really appreciate the discussion and being part of this.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate the comments. I think your comment about building changes over time is spot on. We don't, building changes can obviously have a huge impact. So one thing I will say to that is it would be important for LSPs to document what the building conditions are when they determine the system is operating effectively. That way, when the new pizza place comes in and puts in a huge exhaust fan hood, 3 years after permanent solution, people know that that's a change. That's something new. And again, that might be something, or is something probably that needs to be taken into effect in terms of how it's affecting airflow. So that would be a good thing to document up front. All right. Any additional thoughts about incentivizing property owners, getting people involved? And I guess a question to the group here, and Matt Hale, maybe you had this experience, or Isaac, are property owners coming back, are LSPs involved in some of these sites? I think, and again, it varies, and I've seen it. Sometimes you are, sometimes you aren't, but I just want to hear from the group, like, is that a regular thing? Are people coming to LSPs when annual certifications go out, or is there an annual check? Is there anything, or is it nothing? Probably a little bit of both.
Yeah, it's for me, it's been a little bit of both. It just depends on the sophistication of the property owner. Some folks don't want to deal with it. They just kind of hand it off and say, "Can you take care of this for me?" And tell me what I need to do, and then other times, it's all clear. It's another component of the operating regimen. You call that out. There's a section we talk about, the annual certification, what it means. There's a section we should be talking about if you have a shutdown greater than 30 days and posting notices to non-transient occupants. And, this kind of basically in the operating regimen, there should be an obligation section that addresses that and a discussion of these certification letters. That doesn't mean that every client, every owner is going to read the operating regimen at the end of the day. It doesn't mean that every new property owner in the future is going to look at the deed and know there's a restriction or understand any of this. So, kind of finding a way to shore that transition up a little bit, I think would be important. But, my experience is that it's kind of a mix. I don't know about you, Matt, but
yeah, it's a complete mix, depending on the client, the location, how complicated it is. A lot of folks are able to manage it by themselves, the annual stuff, and you don't hear about it until they've got an issue. Yeah, I would say it's all over.
Okay.
Yes,
let me raise it. Go ahead.
Go ahead, John.
Let me raise a tickless issue. So the LSP has to stamp the permanent solution, and include the operating regimen, and say that with this operating regimen, there will be no significant risk into the foreseeable future. If the LSP feels there has to be, like an LSP, come by every 5 years to make that evaluation, why couldn't that be part of their opinion? That it's contingent upon having an environmental professional come back at a certain frequency.
That was sort of my point, not as specific as the example that you're presenting here, John, but to say that in the spirit of keeping LSPs involved, makes me wonder, and Brian, you can answer this question, in the letter that actually, goes out, and we just most recently sent out around on 12 March, is there any language that basically reminds folks that are receiving this letter that LSP services, consider that an LSP is your tool to, it's your mechanism to ensure that there's that conversation? So maybe some quote, I don't want to say advertisement, but insofar as responsibilities, these are professionals that are licensed in the Commonwealth.
Yeah, Millie, currently, no, there's not that statement, but that's a great idea. We also, we just talked about, would it be beneficial to include some type of fact sheet as part of that annual certification, a very generic fact sheet, focused on property owners again, because LSPs understand what's going on here, but property owners don't. So that's something we were thinking about maybe developing for the next round, a fact sheet that goes with those annual certifications that outlines what this system is and what's going on with it, where they can find things out about it, and probably throw in there that if they have questions, they can reach out to an LSP.
Yeah, and perhaps those fact sheets or the fact sheet can also be routed to other associations and, whether it's real estate or NIOP, others, so that there's that awareness that we are having this conversation, and it takes everybody to make this work. So thanks to everybody for the commentaries and any insight on specialty groups that can promote this relationship between PRP responsibility and LSPs out there to assist. Matt, you're on mute.
It's better to keep me on mute, Millie. John Fitzgerald, your comment. Yes, it could. My understanding, and you please talk to your colleagues at Connecticut Deep, but my understanding was the thought that if an LSP, LEP, if the licensed environmental professional, whatever, says, oh, I need, or an LEP or an LSP needs to come back every so frequently and inspect this because I feel it's important, they would be able to assess whether or not the change conditions could impact things or whatever. there was some resistance that, well, a lot of people say, oh, you're LSPs, you're just putting stuff in to make yourselves more work. This isn't actually a requirement. And so by making it a legal requirement to say, hey, this has to be inspected by an LSP every 5 years, you would protect against that. And yes, there are more sophisticated and less sophisticated clients. I agree with Matt and Isaac and everyone else. But at the same time, you know, are those people doing it with the eye and with the knowledge, right? Our LSP regs, our LSP knowledge experience, both the regulatory side and the LSP side, is improving all the time. It changes. And so the property owner or even like a skilled people at an industrial facility, you know, they're not necessarily following that, and they may not be aware of that. And, you know, the thing I would bring out as the classic example is the huge change in the concern about TCE exposure when new information became available. So I think you know, at some reasonable frequency, and some old LSPs like me could die and stuff like that, but, you know, just you're getting an LSP to do it would help assure that, yeah, things haven't changed. This is still the system it was, or it's still the conditions the system was designed to handle.
No, I agree that saying that there has to be an LSP could sound self-serving, but I mean, if you just said an environmental professional, you know, needs to come back here at a certain frequency, and certainly we can all agree that an LSP would meet that requirement, but not limiting it to just LSPs. So again, once again, in terms of what we can do, the regs are what they are, and we have to work with them for the time being, anyways. So in terms of how we can improve what we're seeing out there, suggestions are great. But if you're a cynical regulator like me, should, or please doesn't go very far with some people. If it's not required, they're not going to do it. So one point of control would be the LSP. When they're stamping that permanent solution, if they truly feel that they really can't opine with any degree of certainty that this will be no significant risk for the foreseeable future without a certain evaluation frequency by a trained professional, that would be one vehicle to try to get that to happen.
And again, in the meantime, I think the least we could do is develop some language that goes out externally to send this message.
Yep. Yeah, we definitely can develop that fact sheet to make property owners aware. And again, some of them may not even, you know, if it's the site was closed out and then sold twice, you know, that third generation property owner may not know what an LSP is at all because they've never dealt with, you know, Chapter 21E property owners or LSPs. Maybe they didn't do any due diligence when they bought their property, which I'm sure we see. Well, I have seen, and they don't know what's going on. So, Matt Hackman, you got something else to add? Or was your hand still? Oh, there you are.
Negative.
Oh, your hand was just up. Okay. All right.
I'd be curious, if you don't mind, John and Brian, the DEP team here, to maybe just briefly enumerate some of the actual audit findings and or inspection findings that, you know, what are the top 5 hit parade sort of issues when DEP is out there reviewing these, you know, the actual system, you know, what comes back as documented, and just to kind of set the stage for maybe some basic themes or some very distinct and you know, pointed issues that we'd like to at least get either clarity or just for folks to kind of see what we're dealing with at the moment.
Sure. Well, I guess I'm going to let John talk about his inspections too, but I mean, you know, and this was one thing he found. we've seen permanent solutions that do not have an operating regimen. So clearly that's a big issue. I don't know that guidance will solve that. Maybe it will help to at least have LSPs recognize that that's required and a component of your permanent solution, temporary solution, or ROS. So that I know that was one big thing. We've obviously seen telemetry type issues. I talked kind of about property owners don't understand the telemetry in terms of how it's notifying them, how to change that, who it's notifying, and they've asked me to change it to notify them. And that's obviously not in our control. They're the one paying for that system. And well, probably not in that situation, but someone's paying for that telemetry if it's there, and they need to take ownership of that. I know, John, I'll let you speak to the other findings. Do you want that slide from your advisory committee meeting?
No, I can briefly go over it. Starting with, I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to say, I think definitely I'd like for those participating this morning to understand some of the findings, because as we roll out the draft guidance, we will definitely hit on those topics. And I think we definitely would like to get some feedback from the practitioner, and also obviously, trying to get into the PRP psyche relative to what is the obstacle with getting to yes on these issues, and how can we achieve more compliance and protection. So, let's continue with the enumeration, and maybe just for some kind of note to reviewers as we issue the draft guidance, we can kind of provide a little bit of a summary of what we have been stumbling upon relative to APOMs. Go ahead, Jim.
I was going to say that initially, I think we need to all recognize that I believe this is the most important thing we have in our program. A lot of what we do looks at hypothetical risks that may occur. There's contaminated soil down 8 feet. Yes, that's important, but we're talking about a situation where there could be continuous actual exposure for 24 hours a day. I can't think of anything more important in our program. Even impacts to private drinking water wells, where you may consume 2 liters of water a day that's contaminated. Well, you're breathing in 11,000 liters a day of indoor air. In my mind, there is nothing more important than this pathway, and I'm just astounded by the lack of awareness or concern that I see out there for this particular pathway. We did 15, we're doing right now in my program, very comprehensive inspections where we go out, we measure pressures, we measure flow, we take air samples, we get a good idea of what's going on. And we did 15 of these last year. And of the 15, 6 had no operating regimen at all. So an LSP stamped the submittal and had an AUL that said, follow the operating regimen, and there was no operating regimen. How does that happen? 6 of those 15 had highly deficient operating regimens. Very little was put in there. One of my favorite expressions was the system is working as designed if you have this negative pressure reading. And the obvious question is, well, was it designed properly? What I want to see is that the system with this negative pressure will ensure a condition of no significant risk for the foreseeable future. I don't want to know it's working as designed. It may have been poorly designed. I don't see that a lot. And a lot of these have really very minimal or no requirements for any kind of ongoing monitoring. I will say that 3 of the operating regimens were very good, and so obviously it can be done. So, anyways, that's what we were seeing. So I want to see more emphasis up front when the LSP stamps these submittals. That what is their rationale for saying that this will maintain NSR for the foreseeable future? What do they do in terms of negative pressure field extensions, looking at the HVAC, looking at varied conditions, having indoor air monitoring? No one wants to do but me. What combination of data did they get to lead them to conclude, to opine that this system will address this most important pathway? So again, I've been kind of astounded by the lack of concern that I'm seeing out there with this. So hopefully we can change that the best we can with either guidance or other combination of activities. So I mean that was my major takeaway, and we continue to do these things. And again, I go to these apartment buildings that have TCE vapor intrusions. I see young women there. And I know that they've done a lousy job in terms of assuring that there won't be a problem down the road. So you can see I feel pretty passionate about this, as well as favoring indoor air. Just to basically recap that, I absolutely agree that the emphasis has to be negative pressure. That's the emphasis of what you should do. And I understand there's other stuff inside indoor air. We've had this argument for 25 years. Initially, people didn't want to do indoor testing at all because, it's full of other stuff. We understand that. We know that. But there are certain tools that we can understand. We know about distinguishing a vapor intrusion from an indoor air pathway. That's something we've learned many, many years ago. And even though I absolutely agree that it should be all about negative pressure field, there can be preferred flow paths. There can be changes in HVAC. And even if we're 95% sure that the negative pressure will assure people are safe, if you're someone that's being exposed, can we go a little bit more than 90 or 95%? It's kind of the critical exposure pathway concept that I came up with many years ago. If you meet the NSR, we're pretty darn sure you're going to be okay. Pretty darn sure, 95, 99% sure, but there's always uncertainty, which is why we want to go the extra step to try to minimize exposures. In my mind, it's similar here. If you've got sensitive receptors, we should absolutely focus on negative pressure. But that doesn't rule out, in my mind, the need for at least some future periodic directed indoor air. I understand that it could be different in different units, but still, it's better than nothing in my mind anyways. So I guess we'll continue to have those considerations. But so bottom line from me, based upon our inspections, this is the most important thing that I think I do at DEP. And I hope that everyone else out there can also take that view and really up the bar with respect to getting these systems installed and maintained. So I'll get off my soapbox for the time being and defer it back to everyone else.
John, I think the most important thing that you guys could do to immediately address the, people operating regimens not showing up at all. Not that I'm saying that I'm voting for overly prescriptive, but maybe if there's a guidance that's coming out, you could kind of outline some of the things that potentially should be monitored. But I think more importantly, maybe provide a template in one of the appendices of the guidance that gives a baseline, something for LSPs to work off, not mandate that you must use this form, but at least it highlights the key parts. And if they want to use the form, great. And probably a lot of people will. And that would probably streamline things for you guys a lot when it comes to going out, making sure these systems are running the way they should. And maybe it's something where there's different sections. And if you don't have a particulate filter, you don't have moisture separation, you skip over those sections, but they can go down through and make sure they're kind of checking the boxes and for each respective category, monitoring the things or including the information that needs to be there. I think a lot of folks want to do it. They just maybe don't have the experience enough working with these systems to know what they should be monitoring.
I think that's a great idea, Isaac. And I think anything that we can do to bright lines that get us to better systems, better compliance, and more protection. So certainly we will go that extra step to capture what makes for a good system. And that could be a tool that's also, never mind, shared with LSPs and part of guidance, but also shared with those that make it happen, property owners. So let's talk about anything else that we have 10 more minutes, and we want to make sure that we at least glean as much, concern, questions, gray areas that DEP should be focusing on and ensuring that we are addressing as we are continuing to draft this guidance document, which again will be available for public comment. Anything else? Or Brian, we had some extra slides that maybe get at a different topic that we haven't covered this morning.
Yeah, I mean, I think we covered a lot. We've heard some good feedback. So I guess just, we obviously have started putting together a draft document and have ideas about what should be in there. A lot of those things we talked about today. One thing we didn't really touch on was just really specific plans and components of the system.
Mm-hmm.
And I know, John, that was a finding in some of our inspections too. There's not a plan of the system, so it's hard for us to then even see if it was installed correctly. And then, obviously that component is pretty basic and vital to future property owners as well. They need to know what the components are and where the components are. They can't really do an inspection anyways if they don't know what they're looking at and what they're looking for. That was one of the big things I think would be pretty simple and to include in your operating regiments. I did talk about telemetry, and we talked about continuous telemetry, and I guess maybe I'd like to continue that conversation at some point. I know a lot of LSPs are using continuous monitoring, and if there's a way that DEP can get that continuous monitoring to know that the system is working, that was an option put in 2024, I think, in the regs. It does eliminate the need for the shutdown restart tests every year for your property owner if it's done and reported to DEP. So that might be something, and I know John's talked about a better telemetry system gives us more confidence that things are happening at your site and may require less, not zero, but less on-site monitoring in the future. John, any final thoughts on your end?
No, I think I've said all I want to say.
Any other comments from folks? And obviously, like Millie said, this isn't the end. I mean, we're going to produce a document which will be available for public comment, and happy to hear thoughts at that point as well, or in between.
Yeah, and I guess separate apart but related, we are in the process of forming a focus group for revamping or optimizing or catching up, updating the vapor intrusion guidance document. That is something that there are elements that tie into this conversation, distinct and set apart, but also just related, because we've got a lot of science that goes into evaluating the pathway and mitigating, abating this exposure. So just stay tuned on that. We are looking forward to, again, anything lessons learned through this process of audit findings on APOMs, and if there are some down the road issues that we've identified here, transferring those so we can actually get it right from the get-go, as folks do phased work and render opinions along the way before we get to that moment of final sign-off. Definitely want to get it right and do as much as we can to address the pathway. So stay tuned on more information regarding updating, catching up the vapor intrusion guidance. And again, it's really been wonderful to engage with you this morning. And for those that would like to provide public comment, your commentary, your concerns, issues, questions, feel free to do that at any time. Please send those comments in to Brian and Sarah. And we'd like to ensure that those comments are captured. And also John Fitzgerald, thank you. We'd like to make sure that any comments are captured as we are on our way to drafting and issuing this document in the very near future. So we want to make sure that that this is not going to be a 6-month project down the road. We have a good bones sort of document right now, and we wanted to ensure that we had this conversation before releasing anything. I think that's been our promise in the spirit of collaboration, and we're hearing everybody out loud to say, allow us to have that commentary before documents are issued for public comment. So we want to make sure that we are in good standing with that promise and that assurance. Any last words, John, Brian, anybody who's participated this morning? And we are very grateful for your time.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I really heard some good comments today that I'll be sure to incorporate into certainly my draft. So I do appreciate people's input.
Yep,
Glad you
absolutely.
said that. I did too.
Yep.
Yeah, it was really great. We've always, we can't do it alone. And it's really the experts, the LSPs that are dealing with these cases on a day-to-day basis. And it's really helpful, certainly, to hear from you so that we can have better audits, more thinking, more understanding of the issues at hand. So thank you. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for speaking. Thank you for expressing your thoughts and concerns. And I think we're going to see a dramatically different drafted guidance document that hopefully hits on some very important points that you've brought forth today.
Yeah, just as Millie said, thank you so much for your input, your time today. Again, John and my emails are up there, or if you guys want to have other thoughts about APUM operating regimens and what should be in there, feel free to reach out to us. And then just a reminder that the next advisory committee is what did I put there? May 21st, and that is going to be hybrid, so it'll be in our Boston office at 100 Cambridge Street, as well as on Zoom.
Awesome. Thank you. Have a wonderful day. Thanks for showing up. Thank you for your comments. We really appreciate them, and we really look forward to more conversation.
Thanks for listening.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.